You won't believe the things these women did. During World War II, the United States entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The country needed to mobilize its forces. This meant millions of men were shipped off to fight overseas. With so many men gone, the US was in a pickle. There weren't enough workers to keep the factories running. This is where the women of the US stepped up to the plate. Suddenly, Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol of the era. But what did these women actually do? Well, you'd be surprised how many different roles they filled. From building tanks to working as snipers, these women proved they were just as capable as men. But first, let's take a look at some of the more surprising jobs women filled during the war. Farming. Before the war, farming was already tough work, but with so many men away fighting, it fell to women to keep the farms running. They milked cows, picked fruit, drove tractors, and even operated heavy machinery. Did you know one woman even invented a mechanical milking machine to help out? She was called the Bells of Belvedere. That's because she invented it while milking her cow by hand. In the middle of the night, she had a light bulb moment and said, "There's got to be a better way to do this." And so she spent her days working the farm and her nights inventing. Eventually, her contraption was picked up by a bigger company and mass-produced. Truck driving. When the men went off to war, there was nobody to drive the trucks. Enter the six-figure female truck drivers. They hauled all kinds of goods, from food to fuel, all across the country. And don't think for a second it was easy. These women faced long hours, bad roads, and dangerous conditions, but they never complained. Working in factories. Factories were one of the most important parts of the war effort. It was here that the tanks, planes, and weapons were made that would help win the war. And who do you think worked in these factories? That's right, women. They worked long shifts, often in dangerous conditions, building the tools that would help the men fight. Can you imagine welding tanks without any safety gear? These women were true pioneers, paving the way for future generations of workers. And now it's time to uncover some of the lesser-known jobs women did during World War II. Cobbler. You might not think being a cobbler is a very exciting job, but during the war, these women were essential. They repaired the boots and shoes of the troops, making sure they were ready for action. Without them, the men would have been walking in unsafe footwear. Hairdresser. Believe it or not, even soldiers need haircuts. And it was the women who stepped up to give them the trims they needed. These women were not just barbers, they were also making sure the men looked their best before heading into battle. Waiter. During the war, there was a shortage of waiters and waitresses, and you guessed it, women stepped in to fill the gap. They served up meals in cafes and restaurants, keeping the country fed. Nursing is one of the most important jobs there is, and it was women who were on the front lines, literally. They cared for the wounded soldiers, both physically and emotionally, and many of them became heroes of the war. Pilots, you might not have known this, but women were flying planes during the war. They were in charge of transporting people and goods, and they even ferried planes from factories to the military bases. Now, let's move on to one of the most dangerous jobs of all, and that's being a sniper. Women were a part of the military, and they were just as good at shooting as men. They took out enemy soldiers from far away, helping the troops on the ground. These women were some of the most badass of the bunch, and they proved that women can do anything men can do, and often better. Welcome to 1943. The year before Pearl Harbor. Germany has taken over France, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and most of what used to be Czechoslovakia. They've also got a pretty good grip on Russia. And though there are rumblings that we might get involved in that mess overseas, right now America is mostly staying out of it. We are, however, getting more and more interested in fighting this thing, and that means we need weapons. Lots of them. Weapons like B-24 Liberator bombers, which we will build by the thousands. And to do that, we will need people. You wake up before sunrise because there's no time to waste. First, you have to get yourself ready. You run a comb through your hair, tie it back with the blue bandana you've been saving for a special occasion, and hope that your lipstick, which you haven't worn since last Christmas, hasn't dried up. And as you turn off the bathroom faucet, relieved to find that the water still runs, you notice a new small scratch on the porcelain. All you do know is that there's work to be done and you need to get started. The rest of the morning is a flurry of activity. You pack your lunch in wax paper. That'll keep your sandwich fresh and the crusts off your apple. You pin a freshly laundered handkerchief to the inside of your work suit. Kiss your mother goodbye, wave to your sister and her friend, both wearing the new uniforms they just got at the factory. You tell your dad not to worry about you, and then you ree off down the street toward the plant, joining the throngs of women who, like you, are heading to the same place for the first time ever. Some of them clutch handbags or purses in one hand, others carry old lunch boxes, all of them apprehensive about what the day will bring. When you get there, you punch a clock. Someone gives you a badge and shows you where to change into coveralls, shove them in a locker and trade them for the thickest pair of work boots you've ever worn. As you pull them on, you catch sight of another girl watching you. Well, you were a waitress last year, but if you concentrate real hard, it's not so different. Once you're suited up and clocked in, you're led to the floor where thousands of other women are already working. Some of them stand bent over, riveting parts together. Others move along an assembly line, sliding pre-made components into place. Everywhere you look, there's metal, bolts, nuts, washers, and enough oily rags to choke a horse. And then you see it, the B-24. More specifically, a bomb site for the B-24, which is being built across town. Your job is to rivet the small pieces in place on the interior. And as intimidating as that sounds, it's not as hard as you thought it would be. In fact, after your supervisor shows you how to hold the riveter and gives you a demonstration, it turns out to be really quite simple. All you have to do is move along the assembly line, grab a piece, slide it into place, and squeeze the trigger. Then move on to the next station and repeat the process until your shift ends. As you move from station to station, you chat with the girls around you. One of them, a redhead with a quick wit and a sharp tongue, tells you she used to be a typist, and another was a telephone operator. The woman next to you worked in a department store as a buyer. She misses that job, but says she can't go back until the war is over. These days, with so many men overseas, there aren't enough workers to go around. If you quit, someone else will take your job, and that will help build the plane that helps win the war. For the next 8 hours, you stay focused on the task at hand. You don't think about how tired your feet are, or how sore your arms are starting to get, or how much you'd rather be doing anything else. How he landed in Normandy 3 months ago with his bomber group, how he's flying dangerous missions over Europe, and how every night when he returns to base, he eats dinner with French families, dances with French girls, stays out late drinking French wine, all the while wearing the mud and grime of war on his clothes and under his fingernails. He'll come back to you, but not if he's dead. And if he is, you won't let it be said that you weren't doing everything you could to help. You kick off your boots, trade them back for your shoes, and head to the cafeteria. There you eat your sandwich, peel your apple, and trade gossip with the other women. One of them says she saw a movie star at the plant yesterday. Another says her brother is coming home from the South Pacific. A third says her cousin is enlisting. And you say nothing, but eat your lunch, peel your apple, and wonder where he is, what he's doing, whether he's safe. After lunch, you put on your work clothes again, clock back in, and get to work. You keep riveting pieces together until the afternoon shift starts, punches the clock and heads onto the floor, watching them as they race to get their machines set up for the next shift. Then you clock out, change back into your regular clothes, and head for the door. Outside, the air smells sweet with honeysuckle. The sun feels warm on your face, and the sky is impossibly blue. It's a beautiful day to be outside, to be away from the noise and the grime and the endless rows of identical pieces of metal. You walk down the street toward your house, past the corner where you and your friends used to buy penny candy, past the library where you read books about faraway places, past the school where you learned your ABCs and 1, 2, 3 South. You stop and stare at each house, wondering who lives there, what they do, whether they worry about the war the way you do. You push open the gate and walk up the path to your front stoop. Inside, your mother is hanging laundry on the line. She looks up and smiles, relief flooding her face. You've never been good at hiding things, but this is important. You don't want your mother to know how dirty the job really is, so you just smile and tell her about your day, about how proud you are to be doing something that helps the war effort, and listen to the radio as the announcer talks about victory gardens and scrap metal drives. Tomorrow, you'll go back to the plant and rivet more pieces together. You won't get to see your friends as much or go out dancing, but you don't mind. You're helping the troops, and when they win, you win too. So when you hear the news that the Allies have landed in Italy, that they've taken back some of France, that they've stopped the Germans in Russia, you believe that it is partly because of you and the thousands of other women who are building the planes that are making the difference. You believe that even though your name isn't in the papers, even though you're not marching overseas, you're doing your part. This is the story of those women who said, I can do that better than you and did. This is a World War II special about the women who really built the arsenal that won a world war. Over 6 million American women entered the workforce during World War II. Let that sink in. That's more than the entire population of Los Angeles today. And they didn't just type memos or file papers. They built tanks, welded ships, tested parachutes, decoded enemy messages, and trained pilots. And no, Rosie the Riveter wasn't just some marketing gimmick. Okay, she was a marketing gimmick, but she was also a call to arms. And millions of women answered it with sleeves rolled up and eyebrows arched like, "You think I can't build a battleship? Watch me." Now, there are plenty of stories of individuals who did amazing things during wartime, and we've told a few of them, but this episode is about what happens when an entire gender enters the workforce for the first time. How does society react? Well, not well, actually. Not well at all. It took a world war and a bunch of societal shifts to get us here. So let's take a quick refresher on where we left off last time. As we talked about in our last episode, by the end of the 19th century, most women worked as domestic servants. Those were the best jobs available to them, unless they could find work as a teacher, which was only open to single women. Married women who worked outside the home were seen as bringing shame on their family. And if you were a woman of color, your options were even more limited. And if you were both black and Native American, well, you had none. By the beginning of the 20th century, new inventions like the telephone and the typewriter brought a few new office jobs to the market, but these were still seen as extensions of domestic life rather than career opportunities. The prevailing thought was that these jobs should be done by educated, refined ladies who knew how to use their God-given feminine intuition and taste. In other words, typing was considered a woman's version of cooking. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had hit hard and women were bearing the brunt. Women were twice as likely to be unemployed as men, and when jobs were scarce, employers preferred to hire men, even for traditionally female roles, like nursing. As we discussed last time, this led to the first wave of women entering the workforce in large numbers. They worked as welders, carpenters, shipbuilders, all jobs that had previously been out of bounds to them. By the start of World War II, almost a third of all working women were employed in defense industries. But when America officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the men went off to fight and the government needed everyone to pull their weight. At the same time, many Americans felt uneasy about the role of women in the workforce. The president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, worried that women wouldn't be able to handle factory work and that their presence would demoralize male workers. Even the First Lady of the United Auto Workers, a woman named All Right. So now back to the story. The auto industry had already made significant progress toward making cars and trucks instead of just washing them. Now they needed to ramp up production to supply the military. Women began working in every area of manufacturing, including as welders and riveting machine operators, jobs that required immense strength and skill. There were even female locomotive engineers driving troop trains across the country. On the Pacific coast, the shipyards were alive with activity as merchant ships were converted to carry troops and supplies overseas. Before long, the yards were turning out a new ship every 2 days. Women of all ages were employed, from teenagers to grandmothers. These women performed every task from welding to painting to carpentry. With the influx of new workers, safety regulations were put in place for the first time. And you bet your sweet bippy there were accidents. In fact, shipyard work was one of the most dangerous jobs a person could have. Working with hot rivets and heavy machinery in close quarters meant that the risk of burns, cuts, and crushed limbs was very high. But the women kept coming back. They were too proud to be scared, and their dedication paid off. By the end of the war, women were building 9 cargo ships a day. There's 9 ships in one day. Of course, not everyone was happy about women working such dangerous jobs. A lot of people believed that women were too weak to do the job properly. But as it turned out, these naysayers were wrong. Not only could women perform the same duties as men, they were often better at it. For example, women welders were found to produce stronger, more durable welds than men, and with a little training, they were able to work faster and more efficiently than men, too. Plus, they could reach places that male welders couldn't, namely inside ships, thanks to their smaller hands and wrists. Women weren't just working in shipyards. They were doing everything from driving trucks to training fighter pilots. In fact, the flight training program wouldn't have been possible without them. See, when the United States entered World War II, the military had virtually no pilots to speak of. So, Congress created the Civil Pilot Training Program to train civilians to fly planes. Civilian instructors volunteered their services and thousands of women signed up. Initially, they weren't allowed to fly planes, so they served as spotters, guiding the men through aerial maneuvers. But it soon became obvious that these women could fly just as well as any man. Eventually, they were allowed to take to the skies themselves. After completing training, these pilots flew all sorts of aircraft, from the tiny PT-17 Stearman to the mighty B-24 Liberator. And although women were technically barred from combat, British pilots flew the first all-female crew combat mission in August of 1944. Although German anti-aircraft fire damaged the plane, the crew successfully delivered their cargo and returned safely to base. There was only one problem. They were never supposed to leave England. In fact, the women had disobeyed direct orders by crossing into enemy territory. So why were they doing this? Simple. Because they were fed up with being cooped up on an airbase. And besides, they had a damn good reason to fly this mission. One of the women on board was a Jewish-American pilot whose family had fled Nazi Germany. She wanted to see the faces of the people who had taken everything from her family. When they got back to base, they were summoned to the commander's office. He chewed them out for disobeying orders, but then he paused. He looked at them and said, "You may have broken the rules, but you certainly have saved a lot of lives." And they did. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers owe their lives to the women of the WASP, the Women Air Force Service pilots. Okay? So now back to the story. While women were making great contributions to the war effort, they were still seen as second-class citizens. Sure, they were praised in the media and even visited the White House, but they were still expected to go back to being full-time housewives once the war was over. The reality of women's lives was that they were working to support the war effort and the economy, while being told that they were only temporary replacements for the men who were away fighting. They were sacrificing their time and energy to help win a war that would ultimately change the world, all while being denied the opportunity to vote or serve on a jury. And if they married, they would lose their jobs. But they did it anyway because they were patriots and they knew that it was the right thing to do. And you know what? The United States would not have won World War II without them. Women helped turn the tide of the war in both the Pacific and Europe. They produced the weapons and vehicles that gave the troops the edge they needed to win battles. They flew planes and trained pilots. But what we do not often think about is what it would have been like to work back then. Factories were hot, dangerous places with long hours and little pay. It's hard to believe that anyone could work in such conditions. But these people did it every day. They built the very foundations of our modern world. And today we're going to learn how they did it. Now this may look like a complicated piece of equipment, but trust me, it's really not that bad. You've probably used one before, or at least held one. How do I know this? Well, because my grandfather used to use one. He worked in a shipyard building ships, welding them together. He had a special talent for it, he said, and a good eye for it, too. See, welding is all about the eye. You have to be able to see the weld clearly and make sure it's done right. That takes practice and skill. And some people just have a natural talent for it. My grandfather was one of those people. He could weld like nobody's business. And when he was done, the ships he built were strong and sturdy and lasted for years. One time he was working on a big ship and he was welding away. Suddenly, his boss came over and yelled at him. My grandfather looked up and smiled. "Don't worry," he said. "I know what I'm doing." The boss didn't believe him, but he let him continue. A few minutes later, the boss came back and he was shocked. The weld was perfect. My grandfather just smiled and said, "It's all in the eye." Now, I don't know if this story is true or not, but I've heard it so many times that I believe it might be. What I do know is that my grandfather loved his job. He was proud of the ships he built, and he was proud to be a welder. He was a hard worker, and he never complained. He knew that the work was important, and he knew that he was making a difference. As a kid, I always looked up to my grandfather. He was a strong, silent type who worked hard and didn't complain. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a welder, and he took pride in his work. He was a father, and he took pride in his family. He was a man, and he took pride in himself. He taught me the importance of hard work and the value of a job well done. He showed me that it's not the size that matters, but how you use it. And he showed me that welding isn't just a job, it's an art form. When I heard that the series Forged in Fire was looking for contestants, I knew that I had to try out. This was my chance to honor my grandfather and show him that I could carry on his legacy. I love welding, and I'm good at it. I still have a lot to learn, and I know that my grandfather would be proud of me for trying. When I was younger, I always wanted to be a history teacher. I loved learning about the past and sharing that knowledge with others. But as I got older, I realized that my passion lay elsewhere. I still love history, but I knew that I needed to find a new career path. That's when I discovered welding. I knew that this was what I was supposed to do. Welding is more than just a job for me. It's a way of life. I take pride in my work and I strive to make each weld better than the last. I may not have my grandfather's natural talent, but I make up for it with hard work and dedication. I'm constantly learning new techniques and pushing myself to improve. Welding is more than just a trade for me. It's an art form. It's a way to create something beautiful from raw materials. It's a way to connect with my ancestors and carry on their legacy. When I'm welding, I feel like I'm connected to my grandfather and all the other welders who came before me. I feel like I'm part of a long tradition of craftsmanship and skill. It's an amazing feeling and I wouldn't trade it for the world. Sometimes I wonder if my grandfather knew how much his actions would affect me. He was a quiet, unassuming man, but he had a profound impact on my life. I'm not sure if he ever thought about the ripple effect he would have on future generations, but I'm grateful for the legacy he left behind. If you ever get the chance to meet someone who works in a trade, take the time to learn about their job. You might be surprised at how much there is to know, and you might even learn a thing or two about yourself. Maybe you'll even find your new passion. My dream is to travel around the world and learn from other worlds. I want to see how different cultures use welding to create beautiful works of art. I also want to meet the people behind the welds and hear their stories. Each weld has a story to tell, and I want to be the one to listen. I believe that welding is more than just a trade. It's a way of life. It's a way to connect with history, culture, and people. It's an art form, and it's a passion. I hope that you'll join me on my journey to explore the world of welding, learn about the different types of welding, and the amazing people who practice it. Together we can forge a new path forward and keep the legacy of welding alive. So, pick up a welding mask, take a welding class, watch some videos online. There are so many resources available to help you get started. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and make some sparks fly. Welding is more than just a trade. It's a way of life. It's a way to connect with history, culture, and people. It's an art form and it's a passion. I hope that you'll join me on my journey to explore the world of welding. Learn about the different types of welding and the amazing people who practice it. Together, we can forge a new path forward and keep the legacy of welding alive. But what about the original question? Could you actually work in a 1940s factory? Well, judging by the comments I've seen so far, it seems like most of you couldn't last more than 15 minutes. That's okay. Not everyone is cut out for that kind of work. But for those of you who think you could handle it, I'll ask again. Could you last more than 15 minutes in a 1940s factory? If you know how to use a rivet gun, comment below. Let me know. I'm curious to see how many of you actually know how to use one. It's a simple tool, but it takes a certain kind of person to figure out how to use it properly. If you know how to use a rivet gun, you probably also know your way around a welding torch. That's a good sign. You might be able to survive in a 1940s factory. A rivet gun is a small handheld tool that uses compressed air to drive rivets into place. It's a simple, yet effective tool that was widely used in factories during the 1940s. To use a rivet gun, you simply load the rivets into the tool and pull the trigger. The compressed air will then drive the rivet into place. It takes a bit of practice to get the hang of it, but once you know what you're doing, it's a fast and efficient way to join metal parts together. On the other hand, a welding torch is a larger, more complex tool that uses electricity or gas to create an arc that melts metal. It is a versatile tool that can be used to weld different types of metals and create strong joints. However, it takes a lot of skill and experience to master the welding torch. That is why it's unlikely that someone could show up on their first day on the assembly line and be handed a welding torch without any training. In reality, they would need to undergo extensive training and practice before being allowed to use such a dangerous tool. Forging is a process of heating and shaping metal to create a desired shape or component. It is a traditional method of metalworking that has been used for centuries to create strong and durable items such as tools, weapons, and machinery. During the 1940s, forging was a common method used in factories to create metal components for various products. The process typically involved heating the metal to a high temperature until it was hot and malleable, then hammering or pressing it into the desired shape. This process required skilled workers who could control the temperature of the metal and apply the correct amount of force to create the right shape. The result was a strong and durable component that could withstand the rigors of manufacturing and use. Overall, working in a 1940s factory would have been a challenging and dangerous job. From operating heavy machinery to working in unsafe conditions, the workers of that era had to be strong, skilled, and fearless. However, their hard work and dedication were essential in building the foundations of our modern world. Today, we can look back and appreciate the contributions of these workers and the legacy they left behind. During World War II, women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter was everywhere. But it wasn't just factories. You've got women driving military trucks, testing weapons, and flying aircraft in the US Army Air Forces. women Air Force service pilots, but their story is one of grit and determination in the face of institutional sexism. So let's fly this plane right into the history books. This is a World War II fighter plane. That's me pretending to be a World War II fighter pilot. We're doing a bit of target practice today with our sponsor, War Thunder. For those who don't know, War Thunder is an immersive and free-to-play vehicle combat game that lets you experience real history through intense PvP battles. Choose from tanks, planes, and ships, all historically accurate down to the last detail. And when we say detail, we mean every nut and bolt. It's the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. The goal here isn't to make things up. It's to recreate history as accurately as possible, so much so that each vehicle has its own dedicated fan base. And with more than 2,000 vehicles to choose from, there are plenty of fans. We're talking more than 50 million players worldwide. If you want to try it out for yourself, then use our link below to get some free goodies. New players will get the T6 Texan and the Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-43, Oscar Zero, and everyone who uses our link will get the American M4A3E8 Sherman, the Soviet T-6 light tank and the German Panther tank destroyer, as well as 10,000 credits and 1,000 golden eagles to spend in the game. And if you want to show off how you earned your stripes, add our custom decals. Once you've taken them in-game, you can show off by adding them to your own vehicle. So click that link and go do some target practice today. The first WASP program began in 1938 with the Civil Air Patrol. By 1941, they were doing everything from ferrying planes to training military personnel to giving rides to war bond drives. But these women weren't paid for their service, and they received no military benefits. In fact, they were considered civilians. It wasn't until 1943 that Congress amended the law, granting female pilots the title of commissioned officers. But even then, they were still denied many military benefits. No housing allowances, no automatic veteran status, no retirement pay, no medical care. You know, the things you usually get for risking your life for your country. But women had been fighting for the right to be pilots since before it was trendy. In 1929, the U.S. Army Air Corps accepted 19 women into the first class of the Women's Army Auxiliary Service Corps, otherwise known as WAAC. This program was basically a mix of administrative work, like typing and filing, but also some hands-on flying. Over the next 4 years, 700 women graduated from this program, but again, they weren't getting any military benefits. They weren't even technically enlisted. As a result, when the men came back from the European theater and started complaining about having to work with women, the program was cancelled. But the army needed people to do the non-flying jobs that male pilots did. So in 1942, the WACS took over the former WASAC and moved into airfields across the country. These women were still volunteers, and they still didn't receive benefits. But now they were wearing uniforms and taking on more responsibility. By 1943, the Army decided that maybe they should actually put these women to use. Enter the Women's Army Corps, or WAC, created in 1942 to take over desk jobs traditionally done by men. But it wasn't all that glamorous. In fact, it was pretty rigid with lots of rules about makeup and skirts. But it did open the door for women to enter aviation roles in the military. First, they replaced male pilots by flying planes from factories to airfields, and then ferrying completed aircraft to their destinations. Basically, they were taxi drivers, except instead of Ubers, they were flying beat, and instead of drunk college students, they were transporting cargo and sometimes passengers. As the war dragged on, women continued to prove themselves capable in these roles, so the military expanded opportunities for them. In 1943, the Army created the Women's Flying Training Detachment, now called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. These women would ferry new aircraft from the factory to the training centers. This kept male pilots in the cockpit where they were needed. The first class of 168 women reported for duty in September 1943 at Avenger Field in Texas. They trained for 12 weeks on 26 different types of aircraft, including the PT-19 and the AT-6, which I'm pretending to fly right now. Flying back and forth between Texas and Florida, the WASPs flew 6,000 planes during the war. They flew them with such efficiency that the Army eventually sent them to North Africa. At the height of their service, there were 1,100 WASPs working in North Africa and Great Britain. In addition to ferrying planes, WASPs towed targets for anti-aircraft gunners, tested equipment, delivered messages, and evacuated Allied airfields when necessary. Their most dangerous mission, though, was delivering new aircraft to airfields where they would be met by pilots who would take them on their first combat flight. On February 1945, 3 WASPs were killed when their B-24 Liberator crashed in England. First Lieutenant Betty Gibson, 24. Second Lieutenant Margaret Pollard, 26. And Second Lieutenant Elsie Bishop, 25. While delivering planes to the Royal Air Force, Gibson lost control of her aircraft, crashing into a tree. All 3 women were killed instantly. It was the worst peacetime accident in the history of civil aviation in the United States. Today, 38 WASPs are listed on the tablets of the missing at the American Battle Monuments Commission site in England, but the WASP's time in the spotlight was limited. In 1944, the Army expanded the program, allowing WASPs to instruct cadets tow aerial targets, test equipment, and fly observation missions. They could even be deployed overseas, but their work was still dangerous. Of the 1,100 WASPs deployed to Europe, 38 died in plane crashes. Still, the Army wanted to keep them away from actual combat. The WASPs weren't allowed to fly combat missions or land on dangerous airstrips under fire. When the WASPs proved they could handle those things, too, the Army pulled them out of the European theater and sent them to the Pacific. But while they were gone, the atomic bomb was dropped and the war in the Pacific ended. Suddenly, the Army didn't need WASPs anymore. At the end of the war, Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights, granting veterans access to education, home loans, and medical care. But WASPs were not considered veterans, so they received nothing. They were given an honorable discharge and told to turn in their uniforms. If the Army decided they could stay on, then they could re-enlist as But by this point, the war was over. Most WASPs just went home. Today, 14 WASPs are in the National Women's Hall of Fame. They fought for their country at a time when women weren't even allowed to vote. And they changed the world by proving they could do anything men could do, even if they couldn't get the same benefit. The WASPs and the WACs paved the way for future generations of women in the military, like the Navy's first female pilots or the first woman to serve in combat. It might have taken another half-century, but today you can find women serving in every branch of the armed forces in every position, including those coveted fighter pilot seats. Outside, the rhythmic clack of hammers echoed off the brick walls, but inside those 4 walls was another world, one filled with men, not boys, and machines, not monsters. Men who worked alongside machines, crafting beauty out of metal and fire. You had been one of those men once. Each blow of the hammer against steel made your heart pound a little faster. Each hiss of escaping steam brought back a flood of memories. You knew these sounds better than your own heartbeat. This was where you belonged. This was where you'd found your purpose, where you'd become a man among men, loud, dangerous. The air smelled like oil, rubber, and sweat. Your hands blistered. Sometimes your co-workers lost fingers, sometimes whole arms. The noise never stopped, and neither did you, because for once, someone finally needed you. Not to smile, not to serve coffee, but to do something that mattered. And you did. The foreman watched you watching the work. His eyes narrowed. Finally, he grunted and pointed to a vacant furnace. You nodded, shouldering your way through the crowd of workers toward your old friend. The furnace. It was a hulking beast of iron and brick, its belly filled with fire and molten metal. You ran a hand over the cold brick, feeling the heat radiating through the stone. You reached out to poke the fire, but the foreman's voice cut through the din. Don't touch that. Get to work. You jerked your hand back as if burned. Right away, Mr. Foreman. Turning back to the furnace, you poked the glowing embers with a poker. You weren't scared of hard work. After years spent dodging cannon fire and marching through mud, this felt good. You didn't have to think about what you were doing. Didn't have to worry about where your next meal would come from, or whether you'd make it through the night. For the first time in a long time, you could just be. The foreman watched you for a moment before grunting and heading off to inspect another machine. As soon as he was gone, a broad smile split your face. You laughed, the sound echoing strangely in your ears. No one had heard you laugh in so long, you almost forgot you could. It was a good life. Hard, dangerous, honest work that made something real, tangible. The rhythm of the factory became the soundtrack to your life. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months. You worked alongside men of all ages, young and old, thin and fat, strong and weak. They were all brothers here. Here you were judged by the strength of your arms, not the size of your biceps. Here you weren't a skinny farm boy or a wounded soldier. Here you were just another cog in the machine, another nameless face in the crowd. It was good. One day a new face appeared at the furnace, a woman. She was small, barely older than your younger brother, and she stood out like a sore thumb. She wore trousers and a man's shirt, but there was no hiding her slender figure or the delicate features peeking out from under her dirty hood. Everyone stared at her as she walked past, their gazes lingering a little too long. She seemed uncomfortable with all the attention. She tried to hide her face behind a wooden clipboard, but her cheeks flushed red anyway. "Don't mind them," you said, stepping forward to block the stairs. "They've never seen a woman work here before." She looked up at you then, her eyes wide and earnest. "I'm here to work. I don't care what they think." "That's good," you said, nodding. "Because it's not easy work." She snorted. "I don't know what it means to be soft." She gestured to the furnace with her chin. "Do you need any help?" You couldn't help but grin. "You sure?" She nodded defiantly. "I'm stronger than I look." With a last nod, you turned back to the furnace. You showed her how to stoke the fires, how to read the metal, how to tend the forge. She was a quick study, eager and strong, and you found yourself enjoying teaching her. Before long, you were working side by side, two cogs in the same machine. The other workers still stared, but now you didn't care. She was one of you now. It wasn't always easy though. Some days the work was harder than others. Some days the metal was trickier. Those were the days when you found yourself glancing at her, making sure she was alright. Those were the days when you found yourself hoping she wouldn't quit. Those were the days when you realized you might be starting to care about her. One day, while tending the furnace, you and the girl fell silent, each lost in the rhythm of feeding coal into the hungry blaze. The silence stretched between you, suddenly uncomfortable. You weren't used to talking much at the factory, but this was different. Finally, you broke the silence. "Are you happy here?" "What? Are you happy here?" you repeated, hoping you sounded casual. "Working, I mean," she shrugged, returning her attention to the furnace. "It's honest work." "I like that," you nodded, understanding. "Me too." After that, the question hung between you, unspoken but understood. Would you be happy if the work took you someplace else? If the rhythm of the factory led you far from here? Her answer came quickly. A shake of the head and a mumbled, "No." Your answer wasn't so easy. You liked working here. You liked having a purpose, a place where you belonged. But you also liked her, more than a friend. You were sure. And maybe she liked you too. Maybe that's why you were having these conversations. Maybe that's why your glances lingered a little longer than necessary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, you walked home with her. The two of you were the only ones left at the factory, everyone else having vanished into the smoky haze of the city. The silence stretched between you, comfortable now, and you found yourself wanting to keep it that way. When you reached her street, she turned to you, her face pale in the lamplight. "Me too," you whispered, realizing you meant more than just the day. You meant everything. Suddenly, she was on her toes, reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair behind your ear. Her fingers lingered on your skin, sending shivers down your spine. Before you could say a word, she was gone, melting into the shadows of the building, leaving you standing there with your heart pounding in your chest and the memory of her fingers on your neck. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The work continued to fill your thoughts even after the foreman blew the whistle for the day. You'd linger at the factory, reluctant to leave its familiars. You'd walk the streets with her, sharing stories about your childhood homes, your dreams, your fears. You learned she was an orphan, that she'd grown up on the streets, that she had no one in the world but you. And you learned that she cared about you as much as you cared about her. One night, as you stood on her doorstep, the words tumbled out of your mouth before you could stop them. "I love you," you said, your voice hoarse with emotion. Her eyes widened in surprise, but then she was smiling, her face radiant in the lamplight. "I love you too," she whispered, and leaned up to kiss you. The words you'd spoken last night echoed in your head, and you couldn't help but smile. You were in love. You opened it slowly, your heart sinking as you read the words. The king was offering you a noble title in exchange for your service. He wanted you to return to the army, to lead his forces into battle. It was an honor, really, but what did it mean for her? What would happen to the two of you? You looked over at her sleeping form, her chest rising and falling steadily. You didn't want to wake her. You didn't want to shatter the fragile piece you'd built together. So you got out of bed quietly, leaving her sleeping as you went to find the foreman. He listened to your news with a stoic expression, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "The king offers you an honor, and you refuse him." You nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I can't leave her." You looked up at him then, your eyes pleading. "Can't I?" The foreman hesitated, then nodded slowly. You knew he was right, but you couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. Why did duty have to come first? the iconic woman who during World War II encouraged ladies to enter the workforce in order to fill jobs vacated by men who went off to fight in the war. But did you know that many women were already working in factories before the war? And when the war ended, they didn't leave. Women have been working outside the home for hundreds of years, but they faced constant discrimination and low pay. So when the war broke out and President Roosevelt declared that we had entered a new world where women and minorities could come together in a common cause and finally get the jobs that they deserve. Well, you should have seen us coming. By the end of the war, 19 million women were employed outside the home, which was more than double the number of women who worked in 1940. Over 6 million women joined the workforce for the first time. Some of those women found themselves working in defense plants, building weapons and ammunition. Others worked in shipyards constructing Liberty ships. Still others took jobs in steel mills or as welders or mechanics. And that meant that those women needed places to live. Places like this, company housing designed to hold workers while their husbands were fighting in the war overseas. You see, these weren't your typical housewives. These were tough broads who had come to work. They were used to living paycheck to paycheck, and now they were making good money. Many of these women made between 50 and 75% of what men made, which was huge compared to the 1930s, when women only made around 32 cents for every dollar earned by a man. Plus, there was a shortage of housing, so companies were offering perks like free rent and meals in order to entice workers to come and stay in these towns. But not all the women who moved into these towns were thrilled about the accommodations. In fact, some of them complained bitterly. Let's take a look at what they had to say. Our first letter comes from the Philadelphia Inquirer, June 1944, and it reads, "I am employed in a defense plant in South Carolina as an electrician. Your paper comes to us once a week, but is always full of interesting news. However, in your last issue, I noticed several items dealing with feminine hygiene products. I know there are many women in industry who would be glad to get such articles without having to pay for them. I do not wish to be considered cheap, but I think it would be better if you could devote a portion of your space to stories about women workers. It certainly would be appreciated by the average factory girl." Okay, first of all, shout out to whoever decided that this letter needed to be read in an Australian accent. You win today. Second of all, wow, I can't believe how much has changed in the last 80 years. Now, when companies want to attract workers, they don't necessarily dangle free rent in front of them. Instead, they offer competitive wages, good benefits, and flexible schedules. Oh wait, no, that hasn't changed at all. Today we complain if the office Wi-Fi cuts out. Back then, these women were hauling around heavy sheets of metal, while ducking the lecherous stares of their male supervisors, who still thought that they were temporary help. Spoiler alert, some of them never left. They stayed in the workforce even after the men came home, and they were unexactly thrilled about being told, "Okay girls, thanks, now shoot." And that brings us to our next letter from the New York Times, August 1945. It reads, "In the small town where I live, there is a large defense plant employing about 2,500 women. All are either married or have steady boyfriends. The girls come from all parts of the country and are housed in a large dormitory. Of course, they work, but they also play. The other night a group of us were invited to a party. We met the boys at the local beer garden. There were about 40 men and 20 girls. After the usual preliminaries, one of the fellas suggested that we play charades. The men chose a subject, and the first girl to act it out mimed a hen. She was hissed off the stage, and another girl came on and mimed a cow. She got the same reception. This continued until a girl acted out a well-known character. The men shouted with laughter, and the girl was given a big hand. "All right, let's see you girls act out a man." One girl volunteered and then mimicked a drunken soldier. "Don't be a baby," she answered. "You're the one who asked for it." An argument started, and the party broke up in disorder. The men stomped off, grumbling. The girls stayed and talked it over. They said that they intended to go out with the boys again soon, but that they would refuse to play charades. One of the girls told me that she was tired of men thinking that they could tell them what to do. She said, "We've been working hard and playing hard, and it's time we stopped being babies and did something about it. We aren't babies anymore." Signed, A Worker for Victory. Your letter is a bit long, but the gist of it is clear. Don't mess with us. Charades aside, the women who worked in these defense plants weren't putting up with any nonsense. They weren't Rosie the Riveters anymore. They were intelligent, capable women who could do whatever they set their minds to, including, it seems, writing letters to the editor. But not everyone was happy with these independent women. Take our next letter writer, for example. This one comes from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1944. and it reads, "Why does the government allow thousands of young girls to work in defense plants? Why does ANTIC compel them to join the Red Cross or do other work that will help the war effort? What is the government doing about it? The presence of girls in overalls and slacks working alongside husky men is morally wrong. Men cannot work as efficiently with girls present. Girls should not work in plants at all. There is nothing to learn that they cannot learn at home. If girls must work to help their families, they should be given lighter work in offices or stores. Such work suits the feminine constitution. I feel that the matter should be investigated by the proper authority." Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help but notice that you referred to yourself as a he when signing your letter. So, just wanted to check if you were maybe Miss. He doesn't want to talk about this anymore. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. These women weren't Rosie the Riveters. But who was? The term Rosie the Riveter was coined by a songwriter named Red Evans and his wife, John Jacob Lobes. They created the song Chattanooga Choo Choo in 1942, which featured lyrics like "You're a Rosie, working at the shipyard, building boats." Their idea was to energize women to enter the workforce, and it worked. So in a way, you could say that Rosie the Riveter wasn't a real person. She was a concept, a symbol that gave women permission to ditch the frippery and get down to business. These women learned that they could support themselves. They learned that they were capable, strong, and smart. They learned that they could do anything that men could do, probably better. So when the war ended and the men came home, it was time for these women to march in and claim what was rightfully theirs. When you think of women working in World War II factories, what comes to mind? Rosie the Riveter, riveting airplanes. Yeah, me too. Now that you've survived your first shift in the bomber plant, let's talk about the other battlefield. The American home front. Because not every woman picked up a wrench. Some picked up ration books, sewing kits, typewriters and babies. Because someone still had to keep the country stitched together while the world was falling apart. But that's the next chapter. This is a World War II in real-time special episode. The year is 1942. America has been in the war for over a year, fighting against the Axis powers. The Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. The Germans have just sunk the Lusitania. And Uncle Sam needs munitions. Lots of munitions. So he turns to the American people to start buying war bonds. And that's where our story begins. Our protagonist, Eleanor, is a young mother who works at a wartime factory. She's excited to be doing her part for the war effort, but she's also nervous about leaving her baby at home. Her husband, George, is overseas fighting in the European theater, and she's worried about what will happen if he doesn't come back. But she knows that she has to do this for the good of the country. As the war drags on, Eleanor becomes more and more weary. She works long hours at the factory, and when she comes home, she's exhausted. But she can't take time off, because there is a baby at home who needs to be fed and cared for. On top of that, she is also trying to keep up with the latest fashion trends, so that she can look her best when George comes home. But it's not just Eleanor who's feeling the strain. Everyone in the country is tired of the war, and there's a growing movement to end it. As the casualties mount, people begin to ask whether it's really worth it. But Eleanor and her friends know that they're doing something important. They're keeping the country running while the men are away. They're the ones who are keeping the trains running on time, the factories producing munitions and the farms producing food. And they do all this while also trying to keep their families together. It's not easy, but they know that it's important. They have to stay strong for the sake of the country and for the sake of their families. Eleanor's story is one of resilience and strength. She and her friends are the ones who keep the country going during a time of war. They're the ones who make the sacrifices so that the men can go off to fight. They're the ones who make sure that the country is still running when the men come home. The contributions of women like Eleanor are often overlooked, but they're essential to the war effort. Without them, the country would grind to a halt. They're the ones who keep the country running, and they do it all while balancing the demands of family life. As the war comes to an end, Eleanor and her friends can look back on their contributions with pride. They know that they've done their part to help win the war, and they can rest easy knowing that they've made a difference. Thank you for watching this episode of World War II in real time. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. We'll see you next time. Did you know that women were vital to the American war effort? They worked in factories, shipyards, and on farms. They also volunteered their time to help the Red Cross and other organizations. Women were also active in the military, serving in the Navy, Army, and Air Force. They were nurses, clerks, typists, and even pilots. Women were an essential part of the American workforce. During World War II, they helped to keep the country running while the men were away fighting. Women's contributions to the war effort are often overlooked, but they were vital to the American victory. I am about to tell you about a crew of women working in a nondescript office building in the heart of DC. Women who listen, really listen, for the secrets the world's whispering. No, this isn't some CIA black site where torture is the name of the game. It's a civilian office humming with the energy of caffeine, nicotine, and top-notch intel. These women aren't cold-hearted spies or masterminds, pulling strings from the shadows. They're the ones on the ground, ears to the rails, picking up whispers that could mean the difference between life and death. They are code breakers, and during World War II, they were the backbone of America's entry into the most secretive arena of all, the battle of wits against the Axis powers. Now let me introduce you to the main attraction. The star of our story today. These women were anything but ordinary secretaries. We're talking about the group of female cryptanalysts who worked for the American Defense Code and Signals Security Agency, also known as the forerunner of the NSA. You heard that right, NSA. So let's get this straight. While men were out there dropping the F-bombs and living up to their namesake, these ladies were kicking butt and taking names in the silent warfare of espionage. It's the late 30s, early 40s, and the world is on edge. The stage is set for World War II, and everyone's waiting for the cue. In Europe, things are heating up faster than a microwave burrito. Meanwhile, back in the good old USA, the government is all, hey, we should probably do something about this whole war thing. So they set up shop in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C., which later became known as the Black Building or Building 400. And it was here that the magic happened, or rather the decrypting happened. Inside this unassuming brick-and-mortar box was a hive of activity. Men and women were putting their brains to work, breaking down codes and piecing together the puzzle of the enemy's plans. But hold up, rewind the tape. These weren't just any run-of-the-mill office drones. They were the cream of the crop, handpicked by the government to do one heck of an important job. Picture a military version of the Avengers, except instead of capes and tights, they were rocking typewriters and headsets. And instead of fighting bad guys face to face, they were battling them on the front lines of information warfare. The United States has officially joined the fray, and the stakes have never been higher. The need for intel is off the charts, and these folks are stepping up to the plate. As the war rages on, the pressure cooker inside the Black Building reaches a fever pitch. More and more messages are being intercepted, and the race to decipher them is on. This is where our tale of intrigue takes a turn. The spotlight shifts from the men in the room to the women at the machines. As the war drags on, men continued to dominate the majority of positions in the intelligence community. However, the contributions of these unsung heroines cannot be ignored. In fact, they would go on to play a pivotal role in some of the most significant moments of the war, like the liberation of the infamous Tehran Conference. Without the efforts of these cryptographers, the Allies might have been operating in the dark. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have some serious spy game to cover. Picture this. The year is 1943 and the location is none other than Tehran, Iran. Now, why is this particular conference so important, you ask? Well, it was the first meeting between the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, where they plotted their next moves against the Axis powers. But as with any high-stakes summit, there are bound to be some complications. Enter the Axis spies who are lurking around every corner looking to eavesdrop on the enemy. But luckily, our team of codebreakers are on the case. They worked tirelessly to intercept and decode any transmissions that came across their desks. Well, thanks to their efforts, the Allies learned that the Germans were planning to assassinate the Iranian leader, which could have major implications for the war effort. Not only would it destabilize the region, but it could also put the entire conference in jeopardy. With this intel in hand, the Allies were able to take the necessary precautions to ensure the safety of the summit. The codebreakers also intercepted messages indicating that the Germans were planning to attack the Soviet Union from the north. This revelation prompted Stalin to request additional troops and supplies from the West, helping to bolster the Soviet defense and ultimately leading to their victory over the Germans. So in a nutshell, the contributions of these unsung heroines were instrumental to the success of the Tehran Conference and the outcome of the war itself. Without their sharp eyes and even sharper minds, who knows what might have happened. But let's not forget that this was no easy feat. These women were up against some of the smartest minds in the world, the German Enigma machine operators. Now, let's talk about this bad boy. The Enigma machine was the ultimate state-of-the-art gadget in terms of encryption, a real technological marvel of its time. Its seemingly unbreakable encryption made it the go-to tool for the Germans to keep their communications safe from prying eyes. But little did they know there was a group of brilliant minds working around the clock to crack the code. These individuals weren't just sitting around waiting for luck to shine their way. They followed a systematic approach, analyzing every aspect of the machine and its operations to find weaknesses. Through sheer determination and countless hours of hard work, they finally succeeded in breaking through the Enigma machine's encryption, giving them access to sensitive German military information. But wait, there's more. This breakthrough wasn't just a one-time event. It was the start of a long and arduous process. The team had to constantly stay one step ahead of the Germans as they made adjustments to their encryption methods. But our heroes were up for the challenge. They continued to refine their techniques and adapt to the ever-changing landscape of cryptography, ensuring that the advantage remained in their hands. It was a cat-and-mouse game of wits, but in the end, the team's dedication and expertise paid off. Their ability to crack the Enigma code provided invaluable intelligence to the Allies, helping them to gain the upper hand in the war. In fact, it is estimated that the breaking of the Enigma code saved countless lives and shortened the, duration of the war by years. But let's not forget the human element behind this technological battle. The women working as codebreakers were not just skilled mathematicians and linguists, they were also courageous individuals who put themselves on the line every day. They worked in secrecy and often had to keep their work hidden from even their closest friends and family. The stakes were high and the danger was real. If the Germans were to discover that their codes had been broken, these women would become enemy no. 1. But they didn't let fear get in their way. Instead, they used their intelligence, intuition, and sheer willpower to succeed where others had failed. Their contributions were instrumental to the Allied victory, and they deserve our admiration and respect. So the next time you hear about the heroes of World War II, be sure to include the women who worked to break the Enigma code among them. They may not have been on the front lines, but their bravery and brilliance were just as important in winning the war. It's clear that these women were not just cogs in a machine, but valuable members of a team whose contributions were vital to the war effort. They were unsung heroines, whose bravery and brilliance helped to shape the course of history. But let's not forget that their story doesn't end there. These women continued to pave the way for future generations of female cryptanalysts and intelligence officers. Their legacy lives on in the halls of the NSA and other intelligence agencies around the world. So the next time you think of World War II, be sure to give a nod to the women who worked in the unassuming building in Washington, D.C. They may not have been household names, but their contributions were anything but ordinary. It's pretty fascinating how these women were able to make such a huge impact in a field that was traditionally dominated by men. It really shows that it doesn't matter what gender you are. If you have the skills and determination, you can achieve anything. They faced sexism, stereotypes, and societal norms head-on and proved that women could excel in the same fields as men. Their dedication and hard work paved the way for future generations of female cryptanalysts and intelligence officers, showing them that they too could break barriers and make a difference in the world. Women made up over 70% of the code-breaking workforce in World War II. And while men got most of the glory, women like you and me cracked codes that won wars. The year before Pearl Harbor, a British cryptologist was sitting at his desk staring at a page full of encrypted German naval communication. As he stared, he began to realize something terrifying. Their codes were unbreakable. It was understood that the Germans had good encryption practices, or even that they de-switched to new algorithms. It was that the computers tasked with breaking these codes simply weren't fast enough. There was no chance that they would be able to keep up with the German production of Enigma codes, let alone start making headway. Then, he had a flash of insight. Maybe they didn't need more computers. Maybe they needed more people. In the past, large computing projects took teams of people working with mechanical calculators, adding machines, and eventually computers. But the thought of a human army went beyond anything that had been done before. It meant nothing less than inventing a whole new way to crack codes. So he proposed a radical idea, employing an army of typists who would type out every possible combination of letters until they found the right one. Sure, it was crude and it was dangerous work, but it was a war and the stakes couldn't be higher. Soon after this meeting, an Allied cryptologic effort known as Station X was born, and with it, the need for thousands of codebreakers. This code-breaking station would become Bletchley Park, and today is considered to be the birthplace of modern code-breaking. The first recruits were given just 3 weeks of training and then put to work. They had to find a solution for one Enigma setting per day, and each team had to produce 4 successful solutions a week. But the biggest challenge was keeping it secret. Each employee signed an agreement to never speak of their work to anyone, ever, even after the war. That secrecy meant that, when the war ended and people returned home, their contributions were largely forgotten. The men got the glory, the medals and the promotions. The women got thank you notes and a pat on the head. But the truth was both men and women were essential. Men had to pass stringent background checks and were often already married. Women could be single, over 30, and without much work experience. In fact, the only requirement for most of the female employees was the ability to type. This meant that women could be trained faster, and since they were seen as temporary employees anyway, there was no reason to invest too much time into their training. But once they were trained, their contributions were just as important as the men. Over 90% of the codebreakers were women, and while they were mostly working standard office hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., the pressure was very real. If their guesses were incorrect, entire convoys of ships could be sunk. But even if they guessed correctly, they weren't allowed to talk about it. Let's meet some of the faces behind the codebreaking. Kathleen, like many other girls her age, wanted to contribute to the war effort, but felt limited by the roles available to her. She applied to be a cook, a driver, and even an ambulance driver, but was rejected due to her gender. But she didn't give up and eventually joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she was sent to work at Bletchley Park as a gardener. Little did she know that this job would lead to her helping to end the war. One day while gardening near the admin building, she noticed a notice that read, "Can you help to beat the Germans? Join the Reds." Intrigued, she handed in an application and got the job. Her role was to plug settings into the bomb, which would mimic the Enigma machine. After enough attempts, the bomb would alert the operators that a solution had been reached. After working there for a while, she was promoted to operator and then to a team leader position. During her time at BP, she worked alongside a man named Bill II, who would become known as the father of code breaking. One day, she overheard him talking about something called the crib, which was used to verify code breaks. He had been trying to explain it mathematically, but it just wasn't clicking. Joan took the concept of the crib and built a bomb program to demonstrate how it worked. Bill was so grateful for her help that he sent her a note which read, "To the best mathematician in BP." While Joan was helping break the Enigma naval codes, another woman named Helen Viola was helping to break the commercial and diplomatic codes. In fact, she was one of the first people to do so. Working closely with mathematicians, she helped develop methods and tools that were later used to break the Lorentz cipher, which encrypted German military communications. Like many others, she joined the team with little prior knowledge of math or code breaking. But she was a quick learner. While at Bletchley Park, she met another woman named Marion Riley. Together, they solved the nearly unbreakable cipher in record time. After the war, they returned to their civilian lives and even managed to keep their wartime contributions a secret. However, years later, they were interviewed about their experiences. When asked what she liked most about working at BP, Marion replied, "I liked doing something worth doing and being in on something big without being let into the secret." But not all of the women were working in code breaking. Some of them were working directly on the weapons used to crack the codes. Enter the Colossus team led by Tommy Flowers. To create these electronic computers, he assembled a group of engineers and programmers, half of whom were women. Working with Flowers were women like Helen Peck, who was an expert programmer and helped write the software that could direct the Colossus to find solutions. Another was Betty Webb, who was responsible for testing the electronics to ensure that they were working correctly. Without these two women and the rest of the team, the Mark I Enigma breaking computer may have never been developed, and the war could have lasted much longer. While these women are just a few of the many unsung heroes of Bletchley Park, their stories highlight the crucial role that women played in winning the war. These codebreakers were not just working with machines or weapons, they were working to save lives. For example, in 1942, Joan worked on a team whose job was to decipher German U-boat communications. By cracking the U-boat codes, the Allies were able to track their movements and avoid ambushes. This information was vital in maintaining supply lines and keeping troops fed and equipped. Had the U-boats been successful in disrupting shipping, the outcome of the war could have been drastically different. But thanks to the work of these codebreakers, the seas were safer and the Allies were able to maintain their edge. But why haven't we heard of these women before now? Well, the work they did was top secret, and when the war was over, they were sworn to secrecy. It wasn't until decades later that the secrets of Bletchley Park were finally revealed, and even then, many of the codebreakers remained anonymous. But now we know their stories and we can see the vital role that women played in winning the war. These women were not just working at Bletchley Park, they were working all over the world. For example, there was the Waves, the women accepted for volunteer emergency service. The WWII were a branch of the United States Navy that was established in 1942 to provide additional support during World War II. Women were employed in a variety of roles, including as radio operators, mechanics, clerks, and even as pilots. In fact, the WWII were responsible for operating the first ever all-female flight crew in the United States. But perhaps the most important contribution of the WWII was in the area of code breaking. WWII were trained in cryptography and they worked to decode messages from the enemy. This was a highly classified and extremely important task, and the WWII carried it out with great success. As we all know, World War II was a time of great bravery when people from all over the globe came together to fight against fascism. We remember the heroes of that war today through movies and television shows like Band of Brothers, which follow the journeys of soldiers as they fight their way across Europe or through the Pacific. But there's another kind of heroism we need to remember, too. The stories of those who won the war at home. When America entered World War II, it was an entirely different ballgame. Sure, there was still fighting, but that was taking place overseas. And for the most part, Americans felt pretty safe at home. At least they did at first. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed all of that. Suddenly, people on the American mainland realized they, too, could be targeted. In this new world of uncertainty, the role of the American homemaker took on new meaning. While the men went off to battle, women had to keep the country running smoothly. They worked long hours keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table while dealing with food shortages, inflation, and the threat of attack. Despite everything they had to deal with, they managed to pull through. That takes some real grit. But hey, not every hero wore headphones and decoded Morse. Some were mums with ration books, teenagers running Red Cross drives, grannies turning backyard gardens into food production machines. The home front was a wild ride, and if you want to hear more about it, well, grab a cup of cocoa because we've got some stories to tell. For our first story, we're heading to Tennessee, where 14-year-old Helen Viola was living out her best life. She had just started high school and was loving every minute of it. Her dad was shipped out to fight overseas, and Helen found herself stepping up to help take care of the family. Now, don't get me wrong, she loved her mom and all, but sometimes Helen thought she was a little too, how do I say, dramatic. For instance, anytime her mom cooked dinner, Helen would make a big show of checking the food rations, if something was missing from the pantry. But Helen suspected Mom knew what she was doing because somehow they never ran out of the important stuff. Chocolate, ice cream, and coffee. Not that Helen was counting or anything, but this all changed after Pearl Harbor. All of a sudden, Mom wasn't allowed to buy those things anymore. No matter how many ration points she handed over, the store owner just shook his head and said, "Sorry, lady, these items are restricted." Helen didn't understand why she couldn't eat her favorite desserts, but she soon learned it was because the ingredients were being saved for the troops. This made Helen angry. Why should her family sacrifice when the greedy rich could just go buy whatever they wanted? Helen wrote a letter to President Roosevelt demanding he fix things. She even started a petition, but no one took her seriously until one day her mom disappeared. It wasn't like her mom to forget an important appointment. So Helen went looking for her. She found her mom standing in front of the radio, tears streaming down her face. After Pearl Harbor, her mom was diagnosed with clinical depression. She spent her days listening to the radio, waiting for news of her husband, and now she wouldn't even come out of her room to eat. Helen knew she had to step up. She took charge of the household, making sure her mom ate and drank. She even finished her schoolwork so she could help out more around the house. Helen never understood why her mom was so sad, but she knew she had to be strong for her. Helen grew up fast during those years. She stopped chasing boys and instead chased after victory. She sold war bonds, collected scrap metal and paper, and even delivered telegrams to grieving families whose loved ones had died overseas. Helen was determined to win the war, not just for her country, but for her mom. Our next story takes us to Chicago, Illinois, where we meet Henry and Martha Mitchell. Now, this couple had been planning on retiring to Florida, sipping sweet tea and watching the snowbirds fly south for the winter. But then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly retirement seemed like a distant dream. You see, Henry had been declared unfit for military service because of asthma, so he stayed home, working as a civil servant. Meanwhile, Martha, who was 63, thought she was too old to join the workforce. But when she heard the call for volunteers, she knew she had to do something. Martha had always been a social butterfly, so she joined the Red Cross, helping to organize blood drives and distribute supplies to those in need. She also volunteered at a local canteen, serving coffee and donuts to soldiers before they shipped out. Martha wasn't afraid of hard work. In fact, she thrived on it. As the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, Martha found herself busier than ever, but she didn't mind one bit. She knew that the soldiers needed all the support they could get, so Martha kept going, day after day, year after year, until finally, victory was within reach. The day the war was announced over, Martha was so happy she could have burst. She threw her arms around the nearest soldier and told him how proud she was of him. And then she did something that shocked everyone. She enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. Martha was finally able to serve her country in the way she had always wanted to. She spent the next 2 years stationed in Washington, D.C., where she worked as a secretary. Martha loved her time in the military. She met so many new friends and had the chance to travel all over the United States. When the war was finally over, Martha was sad to leave the military, but she was also excited to start the next chapter of her life. She returned to Chicago and picked up where she left off, volunteering at the Red Cross and the canteen. Martha was truly a remarkable woman. She showed that it is never too late to serve your country, and that one woman's retirement is another woman's adventure. And speaking of adventure, our final story takes us to Long Island, New York, where a group of teenagers were getting ready to kick off summer vacation. They had plans to hit the beach and go roller skating and maybe even catch a glimpse of some World War II soldiers on leave. But when Pearl Harbor happened, those plans went out the window. The Long Island Railroad became a pathway to war, ferrying soldiers to training camps and shipping yards, and the teenagers' summer jobs evaporated overnight. Suddenly, the only thing on their minds was winning the war. One of those teenagers was Elizabeth Cochran, better known as Betty. She might have been young, but she was determined to do her part. She took a job delivering telegrams to grieving families, often having to knock on doors and deliver the worst news imaginable. Despite the heavy burden she carried, Betty never complained. She knew that someone had to do it, and she was honored to be of service. Another teenager who stepped up was Theodore Roosevelt. No, not that one yet. This Roosevelt was a Long Island Railroad employee who organized the first train to bring soldiers to Camp Upton for basic training. He also helped set up the American Red Cross canteen at the train station, providing soldiers with food and supplies before they headed off to war. These teenagers were just a small part of a larger movement. All over the country, young people were finding ways to contribute to the war effort. Whether it was collecting scrap metal or writing letters to troops overseas, they knew that their efforts might seem small, but every little bit counted. I mean, we've all been living through a global pandemic for the last few years now, and some of us are experiencing food shortages and supply chain issues. So we're gonna use that time-starved, panicked feeling that you probably get when you go to the grocery store these days to understand what it was like to live through the food rationing and scarcity of World War II. Picture it. It's 1943, right smack dab in the middle of World War II. You walk into your corner store and ask for a loaf of bread, but the woman behind the counter shakes her head at you. Sorry, no bread. We had a shipment come in this morning and it sold out fast. All they had were 2 loaves of Wonder Bread left by the end of the day. You really need some carbohydrates though, so you try your luck at the Piggly Wiggly down the street. They don't have any bread either, but they do have some milk. Good thing too, because you've run out and you need some dairy to go with that bread you won't have. The nice lady at the Piggly Wiggly knows that you need your vitamins though, so she gives you a little extra something to help make up for the lack of protein and fat in your diet. Ah, thank you. It's the little things, isn't it? You're in luck, because the corner store has just received a shipment of sugar. That'll be $1 a pound. Now you can finally make some cookies for the kids. Oh wait, they rationed out the sugar already. Meat is next. Your husband needs his protein. He works so hard at the shipyard building our nation's ships. He'd be even stronger if he could get more protein. Too bad the meat counter is bare. After all that construction work, he's just gonna have to settle for a can of Vienna sausages. Those are still meat, aren't they? Maybe you can go to the market down the street. No, you remember, they ran out of meat on Tuesday. And that was 2 days ago. What about fresh vegetables? You can always count on those, right? Nope. Tomatoes are rationed due to a poor harvest this year. Same goes for coffee. You knew that one coming. The government has been telling you that for months. Sugar and meat are the big ticket items though. So you head home, empty-handed again. But you still have some canned tomatoes left. You can make spaghetti sauce, right? And you have some pasta, which is actually one of the few dry goods not subject to rationing. There's just one problem. You don't have any meat to put in your spaghetti sauce. How are you supposed to feed your family? Try powdered eggs, neighbor Martha says. She's got a real flair for stretching a buck. That one. Did you hear she made an apple pie out of mashed potato water? Sounds delicious. You really need some flour. You haven't baked in weeks. but Mrs. Henderson next door made an angel food cake out of sawdust. You could do that or just skip the fancy stuff and make some biscuits with baking powder instead. That would go over well at dinner. You can pick up some shortening at the corner store, too, and then just use your own lard for the rest of the ingredient. You wonder how people in other countries deal with the war, what they eat, how they entertain themselves. Well, good news. Your local library is full of books that tell you exactly that. If only you had something to read them with. The government did send around a notice that there was a shortage of paper. After all, newspapers were running on the low side of things. You also noticed that the Sunday funnies weren't as long anymore. You couldn't even find the comic strips in the middle of the week anymore. But hey, you still had books, didn't you? Reading can keep your mind off the fact that you can't buy any food. Have you heard? One of the bakeries downtown figured out a way to make bread without flour. They call it sawdust bread. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. Especially if you top it with some or maybe you want to learn how to bake a cake without eggs, flour, or icing. You can do it. You just have to rely on the government guidelines and recipe booklets from organizations, like the National Catholic Rural Life Conference. Yes, you can make a birthday cake without flour, eggs, or icing. You'll just need granulated sugar, salt, baking powder, milk, water, oil, and a lot of imagination. No wonder Aunt Matilda went crazy and made the cat food. The war is almost over. Just hang on a little longer. Victory will be yours. Eventually, you can stop making do with just a quarter stick of butter for the week. You can toss away that old bag of potatoes that has been sitting in the back of your pantry since 1942. It's time to bring out the crystal goblet again and use that fine china. There won't be any more wallpaper paste on the menu anytime soon. It's a little too late for that. You're done eating like it's wartime. Aren't you glad? Which marks the day in 1945 when Japan surrendered to the Allies, officially ending the Second World War. And now that I think about it, how weird is it that we're re-celebrating the end of a war that happened more than 82 years ago? Like, why are we still talking about it today? Well, for me, it's because this story isn't really about what happened back then. It's about what's happening right now. You see, every year on this day, I feel compelled to talk about the Second World War, because without it, there would be no today. Without the sacrifices made by those who lived through it, the world wouldn't be the same. So every year I tell stories about those people. And here's one such story from my channel. In August of 1945, an author sat down at her typewriter to write a letter. The ink hadn't even dried before she sealed it with a kiss and dropped it into the hands of a sailor waiting patiently outside her door. Her name was Dorothy, and this was her 14th letter to her dead friend, a Navy pilot named George. See, George had died 3 years prior, after his plane was shot down over the Pacific Ocean. His body would never be recovered. So Dorothy kept writing him letters anyway, not because she thought they'd actually reach him, but because writing them helped her cope with his death. Her first letter to him was filled with anger, blaming him for dying and leaving her behind. Then it became filled with despair as she detailed the loneliness of her new life without him. And over time, it became filled with gossip about their mutual friends, bits of news from around town, and updates on the war effort. In fact, the last letter she sent him before his death was an update on the progress of the war. And this one would be too, because as Dorothy wrote, the world was on the brink of winning. This wasn't supposed to be a victory letter though. She had plans for that. She wanted to wait until peace was secured, and she knew that George, if he were alive, would want to do the same. In the meantime, this letter would be about their lives. She told him about the new coat she bought, about her surprise encounter with a mutual friend who was going to boot camp, and about how much she missed him. She closed the letter with all the love she had left in her heart, signed it, pressed it against her lips, and dropped it in the mailbox. That sailor took the letter to the post office, where thousands of others like it were collected, sorted, and shipped off to distant relatives of fallen soldiers. That same day, men in suits gathered around radios listening intently to President Truman's announcement to the nation. They stood up as one and slowly began filing out, each man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Outside, reporters jostled for position, eager to get a glimpse of the president. As he emerged from the White House, someone shouted, "Mr. President, what does this mean?" He turned slowly and looked out at the sea of faces. "It means," he said quietly, "that we have won." In homes across America, families gathered around radios, some crying, some laughing, some simply in shock. A young girl stood on a chair to get a better listen. When it was over, she jumped down and ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her neck. "Mama, we won. We won." The woman held her tight, trying to hold back her own tears. She had to be strong. For her daughter, this moment would be a defining one, something she would remember forever. And so the mother forced a smile onto her face and said, "Yes, sweetheart, we won." But as soon as the door closed behind her daughter, she let it all go, collapsing onto the nearest chair and weeping. Women had been entering the workforce since the start of the war, taking on jobs that men had left vacant. As Rosie the Riveter, they built tanks and planes and munitions. They worked in factories and shipyards, their hands blackened with grease, their forearms cut and bleeding. They were exhausted, hungry, and most of them didn't know how to fix a leaky pipe or weld a piece of metal. But they did it anyway because that's what it took to win a war. Some of these women came back to parades, returning home to crowds of cheering fans, eager to celebrate their sacrifice. But here, that's the thing no one tells you. These women didn't just carry bandages and wrenches and kids on their hips. They carried grief. They carried uncertainty. They wrote letters to dead friends because it helped them cope. They prayed over empty chairs. They celebrated VE Day and VA Day with tears in their eyes, and ration soup still bubbling on the stove. Some came back stronger. Some came back broken. But most of them didn't come back to parades. They came back to silence. You see, when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States found itself at war. Men were drafted, factories converted, rations distributed, and women went to work. Families scraped together whatever money they had to buy war bonds, and every Saturday, they tuned into their radios to hear the president's address to the nation. They watched as their sons and husbands got onto trains bound for Europe or the Pacific. They waved until they couldn't see them anymore, and then they waited. They waited for letters. They waited for care packages. They waited for their loved ones to come home. They grew victory gardens in their backyards, canned food for the troops, and sewed bandages for the Red Cross. They participated in scrap drives, collecting everything from old newspapers to kitchen scraps. They learned how to make do with less because that's what it took to win a war. Some of these women came back to parades, returning home to crowds of cheering fans, eager to celebrate their sacrifice. But here, that's the thing no one tells you. These women didn't just carry bandages and wrenches and kids on their hips. They carried grief. They carried uncertainty. They wrote letters to dead friends because it helped them cope. They prayed over empty chairs. They celebrated V-Day and VJ Day with tears in their eyes, and ration soup still bubbling on the stove. Some came back stronger. Some came back broken. But most of them didn't come back to parades. They came back to silence. Not all the women were able to return home. Some stayed overseas, working as nurses or clerks or cooks. Others married local servicemen and settled down abroad. Still, others, well, they didn't make it back at all. Some died in plane crashes or shipwrecks. Some died of disease or starvation. And some, well, they just disappeared. The war may have ended more than 82 years ago, but their stories haven't. They deserve to be told, not just for what they did, but for who they are. They are our mothers, our grandmothers, our sisters, our friends. They are the women who came back from war. In the coming weeks I'll be telling more stories of the women who came back from war. When most of us think of World War II, we picture men. We picture soldiers fighting on the front lines, or strategists plotting victories around a map room table. We picture tanks and guns, and fighter pilots swooping out of the sky. And all of those things are true. Those men really did do those things. But what we often forget is that World War II was not just a man's war. Women contributed in ways big and small, and they did it on every front. This is the first episode in a series where we'll meet some of those women. Women who did ordinary things to help the war effort. Women who risked their lives for love and family. And women who took up arms and led the charge. All of them were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, friends, neighbors, teachers, and business owners. In short, they were real people. They were regular women who found themselves living through extraordinary times. And that's what makes their story so powerful. They weren't superheroes. They were real people. Ordinary women who did extraordinary things when the world went completely mad. In today's episode, we'll meet two such women. The first is a young woman named Annelies van den Aert. She lived in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where she worked as a typist in an office. But when the Nazis invaded, her life changed dramatically. You see, Annelies had been born Jewish. Her parents had converted to Christianity to try and protect her from the worst of European but that didn't help much. He bought his daughter a bicycle and told her to flee Amsterdam and hide in the Dutch countryside. He hoped she could live there safely, supported by the underground resistance. So, with nothing more than the clothes on her back and her bicycle, she set off toward safety. But within hours of leaving home, Anneliese was caught. The Nazi soldiers brought her to a transit camp called Westerbork, which was supposed to be just a holding facility. They said they were going to sort out the Jewish prisoners and send them to one of Germany's infamous work camps. But they never did. Instead, after holding her for 3 days, they loaded her onto a train along with hundreds of other prisoners and transported her east. When the train finally stopped, German soldiers marched Anneliese and the other prisoners out into the snow and forced them to dig ditches. Then they shot them. Anneliese was only 16 years old when that happened. Her story is one of loss and tragedy, but also resilience, because while she was gone, her father refused to give up hope. He spent his life savings bribing officials, trying to get word to the resistance and searching for his daughter everywhere he could. Eventually, he learned that she had been sent to one of the infamous death camps. And although he knew full well that it was almost certainly a death sentence, he decided to look for her anyway. And so he got on a train and headed east. Anneliese was working in one of the infamous labor battalions at this point. She'd been moved to the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp and was working there as slave labor. Her job was to sort through piles of stolen clothes. Meanwhile, her father arrived at Auschwitz, only to be told that the camp was off limits. The Nazis weren't exactly proud of what they were doing there, so they lied and told him that his daughter had been moved to one of the other work camps. And so he spent the rest of the war looking for her, always chasing down new leads, and always coming up empty-handed. Tragically, Anneliese was murdered, along with over 1 million other Jews during the Holocaust. But her story isn't over yet. You see, before she was taken away, she kept a diary. It was a simple notebook where she wrote about her daily life, and how she felt about everything that was happening around her. She wrote about the friends she'd lost, the fear she felt when she was arrested, and the horrors she witnessed while working at the camp. That diary survived somehow, and it became one of the most powerful testimonies to the Holocaust ever written. It was published and translated around the world, and today it's considered one of the most important documents of the 20th century. It shows us what it was like to be a prisoner at Auschwitz. It gives us a face for one of the millions of victims, and it reminds us that they were real people with hopes and dreams, just like you and me. Anneliese's story is tragic, but it's also hopeful. As long as people read her story, she will never be forgotten. Our next subject fared much better than Anneliese. Her name was Gertrude Alice, or Trudy Bell, and she grew up in New York City in the United States. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She was just a normal American girl trying to make her way in the world. When war broke out in Europe, Trudy was just 17 years old, but she knew she wanted to do something to help. So she joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which provided administrative support for the US military. After graduating from training, she was shipped out to North Africa, where she worked as a clerk typing up reports. Not exactly the front lines, but still important work. But soon she was back on American soil, and in 1944 she was given a new assignment. This time she was to work at a secret facility in Maryland. It was top secret. Nobody was allowed to talk about it, and Trudy didn't even know what she'd be working on until she got there. As it turned out, she was part of a group of female mathematicians, whose job it was to crack German codes. She didn't use fancy equipment or even typewriters. Instead, she cracked the codes by hand, figuring out the patterns and ciphers used by the Germans. It was boring and tedious work, but very important. If the Americans could figure out what the Germans were planning, they could stop attacks before they happened. And sometimes the stakes were incredibly high. Sometimes a broken code meant saving hundreds of lives. It took Trudy and her fellow codebreakers 18 months to solve the most difficult codes. Germany was defeated, and the war in Europe was over. But Trudy's job wasn't done yet. You see, the Americans needed to figure out what the Germans had been planning in those final 18 months. And so Trudy and her team spent another year and a half breaking secret messages, trying to figure out what the Germans had been planning and why. After that, Trudy's service was finished and she went back to civilian life. But she never forgot her time as a codebreaker. She knew that her work was important, and that if the public knew what she was doing, they'd probably be very impressed. But in reality, she was just a woman doing her job. She wasn't a spy or a superhero. She was just an ordinary woman who did something extraordinary. So that's the question I'll leave you with. What would you have done? Would you have joined the factory floor? The year is 1946. For the past 4 years, you have been a vital part of the American war machine. So, the war ends. You've survived blackout curtains, meatless Mondays, unsolicited wolf whistle, and at least 2 near-death encounters with an industrial rivet press. You've proven yourself again and again on factory floors, in hospitals, in decoding bunkers. The boys are home. The confetti's still raining down. And then, you get a pink slip. Thanks, ma'am, we'll take it from here. The factories start replacing women with returning GIs. Your riveting job gone. Your corner desk at the Naval Intelligence Bureau. Your wings as a VARS pilot clipped permanently. You're told to go back to normal. But let's be honest, after all that, normal feels like a demotion. Now, this story has happened before. It happened after World War I when women were ushered out of munitions factories and back into the home. They'd proven they could do those jobs. Men just didn't want them to. But if it happened once, could it happen again? That's what we'll explore today. Specifically, we'll look at what happened to 3 groups of women working in traditionally male fields during World War II and how they fared as the men came home. As far as wartime work, few things beat the allure of flying an airplane, especially a fighter plane. When women took to the skies as pilots for the Women Air Force Service Pilots or WWII, they smashed through every ceiling except the one that kept them out of the cockpit. While men flew combat missions, WASPs ferried new planes from factories to training centers or test flew them for newly developed instruments or modifications. By the end of the war, 1,095 WASPs had joined the program. Among them was Jackie Cochran, who became one of the most successful WASP pilots in history, racking up 7,000 hours by the time she retired. WASP pilots routinely broke records set by their male counterparts. On September 23, 1944, WASP Jacqueline Jackie Cochran became the first woman to break the 500-mile-an-hour speed barrier in a single-engine plane. But like everything else in life, WASPs were subject to the whims of men. Once the war was over, Congress failed to pass legislation granting them veteran status, and so they received no compensation for their service, and no health care or education benefits. WASPs also weren't technically allowed to fly military aircraft unless they were ferrying them. So, even though they set numerous records, WASPs weren't eligible for any official medals or citations, and as far as the boys in the military were concerned, they were a disposable commodity. In 1946, Congress voted to disband the WASP program. The pilots were given 60 days to leave the service. As soon as they were out, the Pentagon revoked their security clearances and confiscated their flight jackets, which had been emblazoned with the words Women's Air Force Service Pilot. Male pilots who had trained with or flown alongside WASPs were given preference for positions in the newly created Air Force. Some WASPs were offered positions as civilian employees, but only if they agreed not to fly. Any WASP who did choose to fly was immediately terminated. Some VARS-ASPs found work with commercial airlines, but others, including Cochrane, were forced to sell insurance, because that was one of the few fields open to women at the time. Today, there are fewer than 400 living. In 2017, they finally received veteran status and access to the GI Bill. Rosie the Riveter has become a cultural icon of World War II. Her "We Can Do It," but her actual story is more complicated. At the beginning of World War II, men made up 80% of the workforce in defense plants. By the end of the war, 6 million women were employed in defense plants, doing jobs ranging from welding to bookkeeping. When they entered the workplace, women changed the culture of factories. Male supervisors often feared women would slow down production lines. Instead, women proved faster and more accurate. In some cases, they even reduced waste and increased output simply by applying common sense. For example, one woman working on an ammunition packaging line noticed the clips used to hold cartridges together were flimsy and dangerous. She suggested replacing them with staples, saving time and improving safety. Management took notice. Between 1941 and 1945, the number of women in skilled unionized jobs increased from 10% to 34%. By the end of the war, 1 in 3 women was part of the defense workforce. But with the war over, these same men who once touted women's efficiency now sought to remove them from the workforce. There were several reasons for this. First, men returning from the war expected to reclaim their old jobs. Second, many Americans equated a woman's place with the home. Third, the federal government subsidized housewives with inexpensive consumer goods produced by factories that no longer needed female labor. Finally, a fear of communism led to a mass exodus out of cities and back to the farm, and the result was devastating. By 1947, 60% of women in manufacturing were unemployed. Many returned to domestic work or spun into homemaking while others remained on the job, albeit in lower-paying positions. Even Rosie the Riveter wasn't immune. In 1945, she bid farewell to the cover of This Week magazine with the caption "To the girls in our defense plants." While her image endured, women knew her story was over. It wasn't all bad. World War II helped establish a foundation for future progress. In 1946, women's wages increased 25% and their presence in the workforce was forever changed. But the fight for true equality was far from over. For women working in the offices of the US government, World War II brought new opportunities. In 1939, only 66 women worked in the US Navy. By the end of the war, though, the OSS was disbanded, and with it went thousands of female government jobs. A report from the National Women's Committee on the Status of Women in the Armed Services highlighted the issue. After the war, the committee reported thousands of women holding responsible administrative and professional positions, some of them requiring top-secret clearance, were suddenly without jobs or with janitress positions substituted for them. But women weren't going to accept being shoved back into the home. Many of the women who worked in naval intelligence went on to help found the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. Together, they lobbied Congress to grant them veteran status and equal pay. They also pushed for the creation of a civilian intelligence service, and although they faced much opposition, eventually they succeeded. In 1949, President Truman signed the legislation creating the Central Intelligence Agency and formally recognized the women who served in the Office of Strategic Services. Although women were still fighting for gender equality and recognition, their efforts did lay the groundwork for future generations. What do these stories tell us about women during and after World War II? Working outside the home was not only an economic necessity for many, but a proving ground where they discovered independence and self. Whether working in factories, the offices of government, or the cockpits of fighter planes, women stepped up and met every challenge. Sadly, once the war was over, they were cast aside. They were seen as having done their patriotic duty, and that was enough. To men, their contributions were secondary and expendable. But women knew better. They knew they could do those jobs just as well as men, if not better, and they refused to be pushed out. They fought back, demanding recognition for their service and the right to remain in the workforce. These efforts paid off for these women and the generations that followed. Well, they sure did back in World War II when Rosie the Riveter went to work, building bombs, driving trucks, working as mechanics, and yes, even welding and riveting airplanes. Within months, millions of women were out of work. One day you're literally test flying military aircraft and the next you're told, hey, maybe try waitressing again. And here's the kicker, most of these women didn't want to leave. They liked the paycheck, they liked the independence, they liked proving the world wrong every single day. Imagine telling today's TikTok mechanics, female pilots and cybersecurity pros, great work during the crisis. Now go take a sewing class and smile more. That would go over great, wouldn't it? Comment below if you would vegan quietly or if you have staged a coffee-fueled sit-in with a crowbar and a grudge. So what happens when the government starts to pull back its wartime economic support? Well, let's get into it. Now, the first thing to understand is that war is expensive. Like really expensive. You got planes, tanks and boats getting destroyed, not to mention the people who are getting injured or even killed. So naturally, during World War II, the government started spending tons of money to support the war effort. This included things like building new factories to produce weapons and other military equipment, funding research for new technologies, and providing jobs for people who were not able to work in the traditional economy, because, say, their husbands had gone off to fight in the war. It was estimated that by 1945, the US government was spending over $30 billion annually on the war effort, which in today's money would be well over $500 billion per year. That's a lot of money. But all that spending had a big impact on the economy. It led to a lot of new jobs being created and prices skyrocketing. But eventually the war came to an end, and the government no longer needed to spend so much money. When that happened, those government-funded jobs started disappearing and prices began to fall. The economy was thrown into turmoil. Now this might sound familiar. You see, throughout history, governments have tried to manage economies during tough times through spending and policies. In fact, it's become pretty common. For example, after the 2008 financial crisis, the US government bailed out big banks and automakers and launched a big spending program called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. And more recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government sent checks to Americans and also provided loans and grants to businesses. The idea behind all of this is that if people and businesses are struggling, the government can step in and help them out. But while these programs can help stabilize an economy in the short term, they don't last forever. And when they end, it can be tough for people and businesses to adjust. Okay, back to the 40s. As the war came to an end, the government started winding down its spending and pulling back on the economic support that it had put in place to help keep the economy going during the conflict. As the war ended and soldiers came home, many women found themselves out of work. Many of them had taken on jobs traditionally done by men who had gone off to fight and were now being pushed out by returning veterans. To make matters worse, societal expectations were that women should return to their domestic roles as wives and mothers, not to mention the looming threat of communism. And with that, we saw the beginning of a massive shift in the gender roles. In the decades after World War II, the United States became increasingly suburbanized. More and more families moved to the suburbs where women could fulfill their roles as homemakers and raise children while men commuted into the city to work. Women were largely pushed out of the workforce. But some women were happy to leave the workforce. After all, they were now able to buy household appliances like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, which made domestic work easier and freed up time for other pursuits. Some women did find ways to balance work and family life, but for many, it was a difficult tightrope walk. They often faced discrimination and were typically paid less than men for the same work. Now, this mass exit of women from the workforce had profound effects on the economy. With fewer women working, there was less demand for goods and services. This, in turn, led to businesses scaling back on production and, well, laying off workers. It was a vicious cycle. Fewer people working meant fewer people earning paychecks, which meant less money being spent, which meant even fewer people working. And for some industries, it hit especially hard. Take, for example, the airplane manufacturing industry. Before the war, it had been dominated by men. But during the war, women had flooded the workforce, taking on jobs in everything from welding to piloting. But as the war came to an end, those women were pushed out of the workforce, and the industry felt the impact. Suddenly there was a surplus of planes, and not enough demand to keep factories running at full capacity. Companies started to scale back and layoffs became commonplace. So, how did the end of World War II impact different groups of people? Well, for starters, it was devastating for women who had worked in traditionally male-dominated industries. These women had proven that they were capable of doing jobs that had previously been off-limits to them. They had shown that they could weld, rivet, and fly airplanes. But as the war came to an end, they were pushed out of the workforce and back into the homes where society expected them to belong. It was a setback for gender equality that would not be reversed for decades. And it wasn't just women who were impacted. African Americans also bore the brunt of the post-war economic shifts. During the war, African Americans had migrated to northern cities in search of better jobs and a better life. They had worked in factories, shipyards, and other industries that were booming during the war effort. But as the war came to an end, those jobs disappeared, and with them, the economic gains that African Americans had made. Many African Americans found themselves unemployed and without a safety net. They were forced to return to the South, where they faced even more limited job opportunities and the continued threat of racial violence. But it wasn't all bad news. While some groups were devastated by the end of the war, others saw new opportunities. Veterans, for example, were often given preferential treatment. When it came to hiring, they were seen as having a strong work ethic and the skills necessary to succeed in a variety of industries. Additionally, the GI Bill, which was introduced to help veterans transition back to civilian life, provided them with access to education and training, as well as low-interest mortgages and loans for starting a business. This helped many veterans get a head start in their careers and buy homes of their own, which contributed to the economic growth of the United States in the decades following the war. Alright, so how do we avoid this today? We can learn from history and implement policies that promote equal opportunity and fair treatment for all people regardless of gender, race, or any other protected characteristic. We can invest in education and training programs that give everyone the skills they need to succeed in the workforce. And we can enact policies that ensure that everyone has access to the resources they need to succeed, such as affordable housing, quality, healthcare, and a livable wage. The end of World War II was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the end of a global conflict that had engulfed the world for over 6 years and had a profound impact on every aspect of life. From the economic shifts to the changing roles of women and minorities, the post-war era was a time of immense change and upheaval, but it was also a time of opportunity and growth. By learning from the mistakes of the past and building on the progress that was made, we can work towards creating a more equitable and just society for all.